"Come out, girl." Steepa's voice was loud and clear, and spoke plainly, as usual. Osrith hurried to remove tagged seeks from her hip, and she handed it to Aldhelm, with Buey. 6 months effectively a guard in Winchester, waiting for the arrival of the Lord Ethliad, and now, who should appear at the palace as if he had just gone for a morning stroll beside the Itchen. "Winchester, you deserve it," Ethliad had told Osrith. But the Lord of Mercia's meaning was entirely at odds with the way Osrith took it. So she had reluctantly ridden back into Essex and into Winchester, with the only consolation that she had, Aldhelm was coming with her. It made sense. Ethliad was preparing the ground in Winchester, as if the crown was already his. But Alfred was not yet dead, though looked as if he were, and the Ethling was, of course, the Ethling. Officially, the Witan had to meet and decide. But, who was credibly going to oppose Prince Edward? "Why are you so downcast?" Aldhelm asked Osrith, a week into arriving at Wessex's capital. "Do you still suffer from your wound?" "A little," Osrith had to admit, "but it was the place, the memories, her mistakes being here the last time. Gisla's death." She had found Utad's house as she remembered it, as he had left it, even with a half-laid table and a jug of milk still in the boards, blue-tinged and mouldy. Above, however, was silver in the eaves, and Osrith had retrieved as much as she could carry over the course of several nights, going at different times of the night, on different days of the week, so no one who might be following her could discern a pattern. And her silver hoard, in the stables, began to grow. "Is it your lodgings?" Osrith had shaken her head, even though it had been difficult to reinitiate rent to the sour old woman whose rooms they were. She had complained that Osrith had been missing for over a year, and had kept her room for her, and lost money. The fact that nobody else would want to sleep there, too far away from the palace to be a guard's room, too small to accommodate the family, was conventionally ignored. So Osrith greased the woman's hand with silver and moved in the very day she had arrived back with Aldhelm. She smiled weakly when Aldhelm moved his head to the side towards her. He wasn't giving up. Something I did, when I was last here." Osrith's vagueness did not deter Aldhelm, and a sharp pain caused her to breathe out sharply. "You have my protection, as much as it is worth," Aldhelm assured her, as Osrith tried to stifle the wince from a second sharp stab. "But now, you are needed." "Girl. Can it wait?" Osrith called back. The door to the armory was pushed open and Steepa stuck his head through. "It cannot. You are to speak before the Witan." "Remember," Aldhelm assured her, clapping a hand on Osrith's, "you have my full support. Tell them the truth." Who was going to credibly oppose Prince Edward? On the morning that a carriage arrived in Winchester, and a man jumped off the back of it, Osrith would have said nobody. But now, flanked by the head of Alfred's household guards, there was one person. Ethelwold. 88,888,888. May it please the Witan to ascertain why you yourself were in the company of Danes? This question had come from Ethelhelm, the father of Edward's bride, Elflad. It was a fair question, and Osrith nodded her head in acquiescence. "My lord Ethliad had sent me in his stead to duty. On returning from that duty, I misfortuned on a company of Danes." "Indeed?" Ethelhelm again. He stroked his thin beard as he contemplated Osrith, standing between the king and himself. "I had mistaken the road to Aylesbury," Osrith admitted, "and chanced upon High Cross again. So, I turned south, and then came in contact with Danes." She turned to look at Alfred. "I did kill 2 of them, but unfortunately, there were a dozen too many." But Aldhelm had now risen to his feet and was pondering Osrith. "No, I meant, what duty?" he asked. And Osrith knew she must answer. But truthfully, that she and Aldhelm had been tasked by Ethliad to murder the Lady Ethelfled. But it was the king that waved a hand before Osrith could reply. In this company was Ethelwold? His voice, though thin, was still commanding, and Osrith looked to Kng Alfred. She noticed he did not call Ethelwold lord. "Yes, your grace." Alfred waved a hand again. "You have served me loyally, Osrith Lackland, you served the Lord Odder well, and my son. He briefly flicked his eyes right. Edward said nothing, but there was a flickering of acknowledgement at the Etheling's lips. Osric made eye contact with the prince for a moment, before bowing her head back to Alfred. And you have shown persistent loyalty to both my son-in-law and my daughter. His daughter. Ethelfled and Etheliard had arrived in Winchester the night before, presumably to be close to Alfred. Etheliard had brought both her and Aldhelm to him and praised their loyalty. Then Aldhelm had remained with Etheliard, and Osric had been dismissed. So, I ask once more, the king furthered, was my nephew Etheliard with the Danes? Yes, your grace. It's a lie. Ethelwold shouted at her furiously. But Stipa and Elfrith were holding his arms and he couldn't fly at Osric. Which Danes? Alfred pressed. Their leader was one by the name of Heston, Osric clarified, refusing to look at Ethelwold. Others were with him. Who? Osric realized that the Witten lords were inclining their heads towards her. A man known as Bloodare travelled with them. Whence? The fortress of Dunham? A few of the lords shuffled forward, and this time Ethelhelm spoke. And who was at this fortress? Osric swallowed, and shifted her weight. I was captured, I did not find out straight away. She looked to Alfred. Ragnar Ragnarsson, she conceded. And his brother. Utad. The name swirled around them as it was carried in the lips of the lords. Alfred had been expecting that, and he gave Osric a satisfied look. And the Witten proceeded when Osric had been dismissed. She had returned to the guard room in case she was needed again, as instructed by Stipa, but it was growing late when Alfred's man came to find her. Am I needed again? Osric asked, moving from the window as she watched the guards up in the ramparts change their positions for the early night duty. But Stipa shook his head. Ethelwold has been sentenced to blinding, he told her, and at this, Osric's mouth began to fall open. We are to carry it out tomorrow, in square outside the palace. In public, Osric thought, grimly. If she had known in 800 years there would a man living in Italy called Machiavelli, who operated entirely in the idea of cunning and strength, she would liken him to Alfred. Shrewd, had intelligence. He had forgiven his nephew, but at the same time rendered enough of a punishment that no man in his right mind would listen to Ethelwold. It is to happen at dawn, Stipa continued, and I will need you. For what? Osric found out in the morning. Little sleep came to her as she waited for the sun to show its face over the horizon, and when it did, Osric left her bed and made her way across the city. The horses HRMPH'd in their late sleep, dawn-rousing equine brains to the promise of the next day as the same familiar pain came to her stomach. It was not her monthly pain. Osric had all but eliminated that inconvenience with regular doses of lily root, nor was it her stab wound, that had healed well, and only caused her stiffness and made her less flexible at her waist, but a dampness was now collecting in her breeches. On getting to the guard room to find the mail she needed for whatever Stipa wanted her for, she lurched from the pane again and grabbed the railing side that held the spears, which all came down in a clatter. Osric. Aldhelm was first into the room, his boots shuffling on the bare planks as Osric fought to keep herself upright. Stipa, help her! He yelled, as Alfred's guard flung open the door. Just, Osric tried, but the pain creased her stomach and back, and she gripped Aldhelm, who supported her at the elbow, and she noticed a look pass between him and Stipa, as the Mercen lord looked at the trail of blood that Osric had brought with her. Come with me, Aldhelm urged, and he pushed past Stipa and into the back room which contained saddles and leathers, big boxes used for traveling and a makeshift bed, and he lowered her onto it. From the doorway, Stipa held up something which Osric had clearly dropped. Osric had visited Ela 3 nights before and handed over a good deal of silver for the lily root, for the healer was now under threat of death. The king has decreed that no heathens will supply medicines or herbs to anyone in the city, Stipa intoned, on pain of death. Osric, who looked between Stipa and Aldhelm, nodded. Nor was it, Osric panted, putting her hand to her groin. She was bleeding, and it was familiar. but she had not taken Danzi, not had she needed to, for she had not lain with anyone since Finan at Dumham, and that had been nearly a year ago. But the feeling was persistent. "Steeper, get cloth, and water," Aldhelm called, "and I will treat this warrior," clearly suffering from her injury. And he turned to Osrith and spoke under his voice as Steeper gave an affronted look at being asked to carry out such a menial task. "When it is got, I will go outside and you can treat yourself." Osrith flinched again, but the pain was less than it had been, and Aldhelm narrowed his eyes to her, before spying the root that Steeper had thrown down. He bent and took it up, examining it before handing it to Osrith. "Steeper is right," Aldhelm told her. "Do not risk your life for this," and then his face opened up and he smiled at Osrith. "You are to stand guard of the Lord Ethelred as we witness Alfred's justice." Moments later, and taking the steaming wooden bowl that Steeper had brought with him as he came back into the annex, he patted Osrith on the arm. "Care for yourself, I will wait outside. You should knock when you are ready to come with me to the courtyard." It was indeed like an elimination of life, Osrith thought, as clots left her body. She rinsed the cloth many times until the blood was less than it was, then rinsed the cloth out once more, and wringing it out, before placing it between her legs. She then climbed past the travelling cases and poured the waste out of the window, before knocking on the door for Aldhelm. "Feeling better?" he asked, as he walked beside her down the long corridor from the armory to the training ground. "Much, thank you," Osrith agreed, though she was concerned about what had happened. Lilyroot had stemmed the flow of her womanly blood to virtually nothing, and she had no reason to suppose it could be anything else. "May I say, you held yourself well before the Witan," Aldhelm continued, as guards were preparing the ground before the front entrance of the palace. "Many other men would have trembled. You told the truth." "As you asked," Osrith confirmed, and Aldhelm asked, patting her jerkin into which Osrith had pushed the lily root, "Is that the misdemeanor? Seeking assistance from the Britons?" And Osrith nodded in agreement, her promise to not lie in her testimony. Or at least, not the whole truth. That was some of it, but also because she had chosen to try to help Gisela, Utad's wife. Being so close now, as she was in Winchester, was painful. But, at least Utad would not be back to chase her here, not pursue her. And much better, Finan was not there to torment the fantasy in her mind that they could be together. A spear was thrust into her hand as she rounded the corner, and Steeper bade her stand where the Lord of Mercia was going to stand, which turned out to be too close proximity to the punishment Ethelwold was about to endure. For when Steeper thrust the white-hot poker into the would-be king's eye socket, making the man scream worse than she had witnessed on a battlefield, Ethelwold swiveled his head, and fixed his left eye on Osrith. And life continued, and the main objectives of Winchester were to protect Wessex, provide stability in the ever-approaching succession, and to rid the lands which were not Wessex of Danes. Only, life was not as Osrith supposed. Her outlaw brother was on his way to the capital, as she continued to stand guard over Ethelred as he discussed strategy with Alfred in the scriptorium. And that night, one cousin would have words with another, about a dying son and sorcery. Is that true, Ethelwold? Ethelfled, usually bored with her drunken cousin, was more than eager to hear gossip about the upstart guard of whom she was jealous, and she lingered to gain maximum fuel for any future conflict between them. Or any she could engineer. Apparently so, Ethelwold told her, shaking his head. I know that she buys, or has bought, hers and roots from the Britons. In the past, that is, he emphasized, placing a telling hand on Ethelfled's shoulder. And, as Ethelfled paid false concern to her cousin's gouged eye, gossip became fact, which because a weapon to wield. Ethelred had been right, Ethelfled told herself as she went to find her husband. Coming to Winchester was indeed proving to be profitable. 88,888,888. And Osrith did not return to her lodgings that night. Steeper wanted guards on the ramparts that night, and her mind, which had not disengaged from the day's troubling events, made her volunteer. She could walk, Osrith told herself, and by the hour of the moon at its highest, she should be tired enough to sleep. Elfrith relieved her in the early hours of the morning, and they shared a few words about his wife, and her return to Winchester, and potential movements in the lower ground towards the bend in the river Itchen. That exchange made her feel much happier, for Elfrith, having been a close comrade since their appointment together to the Lord Odder's guard, was familiar, was trustworthy, and Osrith found she was a good deal more relaxed as she climbed the stone steps into the stable courtyard. She still had on her mail coat, she realized, as she had gone as far as the marketplace, so Osrith doubled back and paced as quietly as she could through the armory corridor and pushed open the door. In the annex, she could hear Steeper snoring, and she pushed the door open again, watching the huge man's chest heave up and down. Thank goodness for stolid men like him, who knew their duty unflinchingly. Him and Elfgar, long gone, and Elfrith and the men who were coming through the ranks now, like Godwin and Walfear, once skinny rats of young men who were now taller and muscular and reliable. Scooping the iron from her frame, Osrith gasped when she turned round and found a man staring at her, and her heart beat a little faster when she realized who it was. "Edward," she breathed, and made to walk past him. The Etheling did nothing to stop her save talk quietly near her ear as she passed. "I watched you talk to the Witan, Osrith," he said, slowly and carefully, and Osrith found herself turning as he looked down to her earnestly. It showed bravery beyond measure. "Some of those lords are ferocious." He laughed at his own joke for a second, and then reached out a hand to her shoulder. "Like your father-in-law." Osrith thought to herself, but could not bring herself to say it. Instead she nodded slowly. "May I walk you to the gates?" "Yes," Osrith agreed. After all, it was merely a courteous gesture. "What makes you so sad?" he asked, as they reached the door to the stable yard. The wind was blowing through the ash trees beyond the palace's outer walls, and it caught her hair, pulling it out of shape. "Is it Uhtred?" At the name, Osrith jerked her head to the Etheling, and he smiled, as if he had just uncovered a secret. "No, not Uhtred, Osrith," she replied. "He is outlawed, is he not?" Osrith answered Edward, but not immediately. Instead there was a delay of perhaps 2 hours or more, and the Etheling raised the matter again. Osrith, for her part, breathed heavily onto his bare chest as the Lord Prince's hands fondled her breast, feeling her nipple gently with his fingers. "Not Uhtred, but someone close to him? One of his men, perhaps? Do you wish that you were together?" Osrith looked up from his arm. "There cannot be a together," Osrith replied. "Because of the man you loved." Osrith shuffled up in Edward's bed, turned over and looked at him. "Because at some point a man must make a commitment, and he will never leave Uhtred." Edward looked at her face and then smoothed his fingers through her hair. "Have you asked him?" Osrith shook her head. "No, I never have," she admitted. "And I thought you brave, Osrith," he teased, gently, before reaching for her lips with his own. "I cannot think about this now," Osrith replied, pain in stomach again making her flinch. "You are unwell?" Edward asked, concerned. He shuffled up the bed and helped to prop Osrith up. She sat on the edge of his bed and flinched again. "A little," she replied. She felt sick, as if the whole room was moving. Edward placed a tender hand on her back. "Willow bark is a help, I am given to understand. The kitchen keep it," he added. Osrith nodded, and began to dress. As was his custom, Edward watched her put on her clothes with as much fascination as he did when he relieved her of them. But, it was not that sort of pain, and Osrith knew she needed to speak to Allah. "Is Elflad a help? Can you talk to her as your father talks to your mother?" Osrith asked, when she was clothed. Edward placed a hand over hers, but said nothing, and she realized this was the first time they had humped since Edward had married. When you are king, Ethelhelm will have more influence than you realize. And she realized he had picked up her hand, and was pressing his lips to her skin. She also realized he was still naked and his cock had definitely not been informed of her impending departure. "Osrith, I need you," Edward said, his voice catching in his throat as his breathing grew deeper. And no one had informed Osrith's hypothalamus, either. "I will stop to guard you, nothing more." Those were the words, at least, that Osrith's mouth had spoken. "Then you should sleep this side of the door," was his practiced answer. Yet the Etheling kissed down the back of her neck as his hands traced over her shoulders, and soon Osrith was on her back, having been eaten out as Edward rode her in his own firm passionate way, eyes never straying from her face, expression saying, "You are being humped by a future king, and I am attentive to my lovers." And then, when they had come, and Osrith was in his arms again, he traced his finger over her hand's width scar on her ribs, just under her left breast. "Beanflout," she replied, as Edward kissed her head, before nibbling her ear. He broke off and looked over at her. "You were there?" "I've fought there twice," Osrith replied, then teased, "once more than you, my lord." And Edward laughed and turned her over again, so he was on top of her once more, vigorously showing Osrith what he thought of her impertinence. 88,888,888. Osrith went from the bed of the Etheling to the ramparts above his room as dawn began, tired, and still in a good deal of discomfort. At least the day was warm, and later, when she was dismissed from duty, she found herself walking briskly through the marketplace and westwards, towards the convenient bend in the river where she could bathe. So she was just crossing back to her room, taking the route by the chapel, when she saw a small figure, shawl pulled around their head, moving at speed along Aldgate. Behind her, a man was moving, striding in the direction of the first figure, raising a hand to throw something, and when the first figure turned, ducking into the shadows. When it happened again, Osrith jumped in front of the man, who gave her a sneery look, until Osrith withdrew away. Then his expression changed, and he stepped back for a couple of steps and, with no words, turned to run. But the first figure was running too, and it took a little time for Osrith to catch up with them, who turned out to be a her when Osrith ran past and stopped in front of them, and the her turned out to be Thyra. Osrith's voice was enough to make Bicker's wife jump, and she placed a hand carefully on the woman's shoulder. "Tell Bicker," Osrith advised. When they walked a few steps with Thyra and then into her home rather than leaving her, the woman was insistent, and Osrith felt sorry for her as she dropped a plank of wood in the iron brackets at either side of the front door frame, then moved to the back and barred that, too. "No, I do not wish to shame Bicker," Thyra replied, her hand on her chest as she fought to regain control of her breathing. But her face betrayed her terror, and Osrith placed a hand on her arm. "Shame Bicker? You would no more shame Bicker than the moon could shame the sun." And then the sun came out, as the Danish woman gave Osrith a beaming smile. "He told me about you," she told Osrith, tipping away water from a jug before placing another in the table beside the window, 2 wooden beakers either side of it, and she gestured to the chairs opposite one of them. But Osrith was immobile as she asked, "What? What did he tell you?" "You were a dear child when you had left Bibbenberg," she sparkled. "You lost him, we gained him." But then she looked at Osrith as if she might have angered her. But Osrith was thoughtful. "It is why I am here, Thyra," Osrith admitted. "Did Bicker tell you I escaped Bibbenberg? That I spent time with the Scotti, the Gales? I stood beside the king's commander as he slew Ivar. I slew many Norse," she added, matter-of-factly. "You?" Thyra looked astonished. "My father would have liked you. He wished for women warriors, but some of his men did not like the idea. I would have fought, but my mother did not want it." Perhaps it would have been a good idea to have learned, Osrith thought, looking at Thyra's earnest, happy, scarred face. She had done that to herself, Osrith knew, after years as a sex slave. She had trained the dogs to guard her. Had she been at Dumham longer, she may well have contrived to defeat Kjartan and Sven herself, through her own will. "Will they come back?" Osrith asked, and Thyra looked away. "It is since Danes have been known to be coming to Wessex," she replied. "My brother," and, at that, soft tears formed at her eyes. "Ragnar?" She nodded, and Osrith brought the woman round to her shoulder. "It has been happening for some time?" and noticed her distended stomach. A pregnant woman, harassed, no one to stand up for her. But, could she stand up for herself? Unbuckling her belt, she let it fall as she held tagged Sikhs, before offering it to the Danish woman. She held the scabbard as Osrith withdrew the blade. "Can you use it? Pointy end first?" Thyra laughed, like glass tinkling. She was so beautiful, and she looked every inch a woman warrior that her father might have been proud of. "I have a secret too," Thyra confided as she smoothed her dress over her stomach. "Not many months," Osrith guessed. "She should be here by July." July, Osrith repeating, and remembered cold snow and a fire-red dawn and drinking and merriment with Eric's Northmen as they travelled towards Dunnottar. Christmas, Thyra assumed it was a question and translated it for her. She placed a hand on Osrith's shoulder. "I worry for Uhtred. He was sickened by grief for his wife." And it all came tumbling out, as Osrith said, "I tried, Thyra." She was not herself, and was distressed. "I tried to ask Allah to come." The Danish woman looked into her eyes. "That was brave of you. The Britons won't, you see, so she told me what to do. I tried to help her and she died." And Osrith was crying now, but not for Gisela and the situation, but for everything, and for nothing, and for all that was wrong with everything, that no matter how hard she tried to make things better, it always ended up worse. "In your heart, you did what you could, and took a lot of risks for Gisela," Thyra consoled. "But she died. People die. It was her time, there is a reason." And she looked at Osrith's face. "Ragnar died." "He has died?" Osrith remembered a firm, handsome face, a good heart, someone who was fair and just, who cared for honor and for his men. A Dane, nonetheless, but a decent human. "You are a Christian," she laughed again. "Perhaps there is not much difference between Christianity and Danish beliefs. Though," Thyra added, "don't tell Bika I told you so." And Thyra went on to tell her how Ragnar had died without a blade in his hand, and that now he was in the coldness of hell, Niflheim, with but one chance to have it undone. How it was Thyra knew this, Osrith didn't think to ask. Perhaps if she had, Osrith's path might have been different. Perhaps she would have been there when the fire began, and she could have helped the woman escape to safety, rather than drag her charred body to the Briton healer and take a not-yet-term baby girl away with her to Alba. But Osrith was tired, and due to be back at the palace, to stand guard outside the Lord Ethelred's chambers, so she accepted Thyra's thanks for the Sikhs, and she thanked her back for the water, and did not see a pair of eyes belonging to a man who loved her watch her cross back into the main market square and go back to the palace. 88,888,888. When she was dismissed from Ethelred's door in the early hours in the morning, after the third whore had left and presumably exhausted the Lord of Mercia, Osrith did not go back to her rooms. She hated the place, if she was honest, and her mind was racing again, so instead, heading to the scriptorium, which was shared between the palace and the monastery, and decided to see what correspondence had come in from other monasteries. Culda's was the one she wanted to know most about, the one monastery which faced Dunnottar across the mighty Forth River, and was a boat journey between them. She was decided, and was certain of the fact. Once she had enough silver she would be travelling to her true home, Alba, and begging forgiveness of Domhnall. If indeed he was still king, and her heart grew sore as she remembered the people who she loved the most standing before her, engaging in an agreement with Uhtred for the hostage value of Constantine's son. Would Seljuk be back now? Presumably, as the Danes had marched, and she couldn't countenance that he had been put to death. Would Sainid have led enough forces to wear down Elfric's defences, leaving Bibbenberg depleted of warriors and resources? So it was heartening to find that Domhnall was indeed doing well, and had had enough peaceful years to reorganize the church and the governance of the land in Alba, where Mormers, lords of Terriery, had been appointed according to their ancient acreages, and reported to Domhnall with tribute and men for war, and were in turn rewarded with wealth. It was not too dissimilar, Osrith realized, to the Witan of the Angles and Saxon kingdoms. It showed Domhnall was moving away from the Aryan people, the pagans like Beatha, and had firmly established Irish Christianity in his kingdom. As she made to leave, a noise made her start, and she reached for her non-existent Sikhs. When she came up with nothing, Osrith fixed herself still, and listened, as a board creaked near the door. She was just passing over to it, when a hand caught her mouth. Osrith fought, but she was slammed up against a wall. It was Ethelwold. Even before she could see his face in one of the candles' weak illumination, she could tell, and realized with horror that, as he blinked there was a kind of squelching noise, which was presumably the flesh around his missing eye. "So, you visit the Britons for roots and medicines," Ethelwold began as he trailed a hand down her shirt. "You know, that is against the law now?" Osrith struggled, but he held her fast. "And, I know you to be a witch," she struggled, but he placed a hand firmly over her nose and mouth, a witch who cast a spell on the wife of an ealdorman who was giving birth and, she died. How? How did he know? Osrith's head was spinning through lack of air and she struggled against suffocation as Ethelwold eased his other hand down her breeches. "If you do not want this to be known," he continued, his fingers on her pubic hair as his digits scrabbled for her cunt, "you must come with recompense, 1,000 silver pieces or—" He found her clitoris for a moment, but Osrith struggled and his hand shifted away. "Another form of payment." He loosed her face, and Osrith sagged against the door, trying to recover her breath. "Or I will go to the king." And with that, he pushed the door against her and was gone. With any other man, Osrith knew, she would call his bluff. But Ethelwold had no scruples, he had no honor by which to attack back. He clearly wanted something from Osrith, power, perhaps, and she wondered whether the hole in the stable floor where she had put aside some large aliquots of treasure for nearly a year, once belonging, temporarily, to Utad, would amount to 1,000 pieces. Osrith adjusted her clothing, trying not to think of Ethelwold's hands on her intimate parts, and she crossed the market to get to her rooms, weighing up her options. No, it was the silver. Either that, or she would have to flee to Alba empty-handed.